All right. Welcome to Lamp. Hey everybody, welcome back. So I know maybe you're like, whoa, what the heck is Lamp? What is this? This is new, this is different. And to all 9 of you, I say, we're changing it up. This channel is really small, I can still do that without people being weird about it. I can do whatever I want. My dog's barking. So in light of AMC's new show, Interview with the Vampire, I really wanted to get back into the Interview with the Vampire franchise. I am a huge fan of the original film, which came out in 1994, starring Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. So that inspired me to read the book by Anne Rice, which started the whole entire enormous chronicle of vampire stories, which I will absolutely never read, ever, because it was agonizing. This book was so boring. Let's get into it. So our focus today is queer baiting versus queer fetish versus queer coding. So that's all right. That's a lot to unpack. Let's get into it. Let me explain some things. If you've seen any of my previous videos, I've talked a little bit about the Hays Code. So let me get into that again. So the Hays Code was from 1934 to 1968. It was named after William H. Hays, who was the president of the Motion Picture Production Company. And at first it wasn't very well done. Like, people just kind of ignored it and they were like, oh, whatever. Like, it's just another rule that we're gonna break. Like, no one really cared. That is when Joseph Breen comes in and he's like, heck no. I will not stand for this deviancy, this queerness in film. Stop it right now. So before Joseph, we had films like The Wild Party in 1929 and Dance Girl Dance in 1940, both directed by Dorothy Arzner, who was an openly queer film director. During the time of the 30s to the 60s, essentially you did not want to be associated with queerness or LGBTQ, gay, whatever. If you were associated with it, you could lose your job, you could lose your position, you could lose a lot of money, and, you know, capitalist drive to pretend to be straight. Very real. So that gets into queer coding. What does that mean? Queer coding is when a character is assumed to be gay based on how they act, how they dress, how they look, even though nothing explicitly gay happens. Like, you never see this character kiss someone of the same sex, you never see them in an intimate scene, they never speak about partners, there's nothing like that, it's never explicitly said. But for example, we have the sort of foppish man character, you know, the one that's very effeminate, they have like the gay lisp, you know, the thing. That's sort of where this came from, out of this era of like, they're gay, but we're not saying they're gay.
I may not know my flowers, but I know a bitch when I see one.
And now most of the time, queer-coded characters were queer villains. And this was because it was okay if your character was queer if you were saying that it was morally inappropriate. If that was what you were trying to say with that character. So a lot of people got away with creating these queer villains because of they were pretending to say that, basically. So especially in Disney, we see this a lot, especially like Ursula, who was based on the drag queen Divine. We have Maleficent, who was like very much a misandrist. Like, she would never be around people in general, but like especially not men. So it is just kind of assumed that she was gay. One of my favorite examples is him from the Powerpuff Girls. I know you know. I know you remember. The red crab guy in the lingerie. I know you know. I know that was your sexual awakening. It's okay, me too. But generally, this was sort of the ignition point for all of these other queer tropes that came out of that. So we have characters like the cross-dressing killer, like Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. We also have like the sissy character, which is like the very unmanly man, like sissy man who's gonna act like a woman because have you ever met a woman? Obviously not. So then we have this trope of the second in command, which A good example would be LeFou from Beauty and the Beast, who just pines after Gaston, just follows him around everywhere, just picks up after him. Oh, Gaston, Gaston, my love, my darling baby boy, can I get you an egg? And then we have like the queer best friend, which was sort of that thing that you thought was real in high school, and so you like sought out gay men so you could be friends with them, and it was really weird of you to do. So that's sort of what we're talking about when we talk about queer coding, is a character that is assumed to be gay without being explicitly gay. Now let's talk about queer baiting. So this is sort of a newer idea, because after this time of queer coding, we could actually have explicitly queer characters. And so when people started doing that or playing with that, sometimes it became problematic. So queer baiting is when there are two characters that have this sort of will they, won't they energy. They're always like getting a little too close. You're like, oh, are they gonna kiss? And they're kind of, they talk about each other in a way that's very loving, but they can't admit their feelings for each other. The best example ever is Cass and Dean from Supernatural. And even though in the end, Cass was like, oh, Dean, I love you, they sent him to super hell. So that was just a barrier gaze. It was fine. It was baiting the whole time. Like, it was garbage. So that's queer coding versus queer baiting. Queer coding was a way of like trying to affirm queerness when it was illegal to do so, while queer baiting is trying to make money off of queer people by being like, oh, maybe they're gay, but like not pushing the comfort of your straight audience. Several days have passed. Hello. I forgot to say something. Queer baiting is not when someone will not publicly disclose their sexuality. It is not when an actor is playing a queer character and you don't know what their sexuality is. You don't get to force someone to come out just because you want to know or you feel like they're not queer enough for a part. That's not up to you. That is like their own private thing. Would you want someone to out you? Probably not. And no, it's not different because they're a celebrity and because they're in the public eye and because they're playing a queer character. It's not different. They're still just a person and they deserve their privacy. So queer baiting is not when Harry Styles wears a dress, okay? Queer baiting is not when the main character of Heartstoppers may not be gay. Also, he is 18. Leave that man alone. He's a teenager. Leave him alone. Queer baiting is specifically when someone is financially or otherwise gaining or benefiting from the use of queer characters that don't actually become queer characters. So the sexual tension between two same-sex people, yada, 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 but never challenging the comfort of their heterosexual audience. Okay? It's literature, it's media, it's books, it's movies. It's not individuals. Stop harassing people. Okay, thanks. Now, queer fetishizing. That is where we get into the danger zone. Like, red alert, bad. Don't stop. The history of queer fetishizing often comes with the male gaze. So the most common example is when lesbian porn or lesbian smut is written for men. So essentially it like gives them the idea that eventually they can join or that they can turn the lesbian straight. There's still sort of this like hope for men in these scenarios. Let me tell you guys, there's no hope for you, just saying. And it also happened with Eminem /fic, which was written by straight women. And typically these fics were very explicit, sometimes gruesome sex. I can fucking talk. I promise you I can talk. /fic was often written by straight women who were fantasizing about the queer experience. And often they would write something that was very aggressive and could often be sexual assault. And it just becomes this sort of like fantasy for them that they're acting out. And it typically involves a very experienced, manly man who, he's been around. And then a very like inexperienced, sort of effeminate man who generally gets taken advantage of. Often with these fics, the idea is that eventually they will like get out of the queer relationship and find like a healthier, better straight relationship. So it generally portrays them in an extremely negative way, as like one of the partners is always abusive, or one of the partners is always like bad for the good character. In the same way, in lesbian fiction, or lesbian fiction that was written by straight men, they would have like a masculine woman and a feminine woman, and the masculine woman would also be abusive, as if to say that she is no better than a man, and so then that abused lesbian will, or the trope of the battered lesbian, will end up with a man in the end. So the whole point of this fetishizing fiction is to portray queerness in a negative way so that it is acceptable by straight audiences. Fun fact, pulp magazines, which were named for the pulp, or like the pulp or the very cheap paper they were printed on, were printed from 1896 to the 1950s, and generally refers to low quality fiction, which was usually just sexual or explicit in nature, and not always were these like fetish, but like, I don't know, just that was a fun fact that I learned. So if you have any experience with Interview with the Vampire, you might be asking, why am I talking about fetish? There's no explicit sexual content in the movie or the book, and you would be correct. However, I do believe that Anne Rice uses a lot of these tropes and these stereotypes in the relationship that she creates, and because the relationship is so extremely abusive and toxic, I think that she was essentially feeding off of stereotypes of fetishization without making it explicit, and I will get into that in a moment. Now, before I jump right into Interview with the Vampire, I do want to talk about vampires in literature history, which I also think I'm going to make another video on, like, because there's a massive like literature background of vampires. It's absolutely fascinating. So I'll get into that more. But today I just want to really talk about like the main big vampires and how they ultimately feed into queerness. And I'm going to start with Carmilla, because she came before Dracula. And I know like a lot of people are like, Dracula, he's the vampire. And we'll get there. We'll talk about Dracula, I promise. Let's start with Carmilla, because she was the original lesbian vampire. Let me tell you what I mean. So in Carmilla's story, she is trying to tempt the character Laura. And essentially this story is a metaphor for societal fears of lesbianism, because Carmilla is trying to tempt this woman, trying to seduce her into like, you know, letting her feed on her, bleh. And, you know, Laura is obviously being tempted because there's like nothing holding her back, and it's like society is not protecting her against this temptation. I mean, what else is there to say? Like, it's gay. So, but also the act of vampirism in literature generally becomes queerness because
vampires are gay.
And I'll cite this article in the link below. So in the article, Queering the Vampire by Sophie Breeze on Antithesis Journal, she talks about how the vampire, I mean, the whole point of the vampire is to penetrate you. They have to, you know, bite into your neck. They have to penetrate your neck in order to get the blood, which is, you know, the thing that gives them life. But that act of penetration is like inherently sexual. And at the same time, you know, they're doing the masculine thing, which is so they're doing the masculine thing, which is the penetration, but also vampires can create more of their own. It doesn't matter the gender. So that is sort of this like male and female inside of the same body, you know, the penetration and the creation of more vampires. So they are inherently this sort of non-binary or gender non-confirming creation, and they just already inherently have queerness because of that. So in the same way that Carmilla is this temptation for Laura of lesbianism, of like refuting society, of, you know, this forbidden love, Dracula is also a temptation for Mina. And the societal fear in that story is the fear of a woman's individuality and sort of being alone in society, because at the time of the story, I think her husband was like overseas or something. But anyway, So Dracula is also trying to tempt her to seduce her into like his sort of deviancy. And we're going to talk a lot about like deviant sexuality. Yes, that is a derogatory term, and we're talking about it in this context because like Anne Rice is being derogatory. So vampires have always been about seduction and temptation and deviancy. That is already in the history of vampire literature. So Anne Rice is just playing off of that, except for Nosferatu. There's like very, very particular vampire stories that are like not sexy vampires, and I really, really adore them. So like there's Nosferatu, who's like, he's creepy, he's got like the long front teeth, kind of looks like a hamster, and he's got like the pointed ears and like the bald head, and he really does look like a man that just crawled out of the grave. Like he looks undead, he's creepy. Same thing with like the creatures in I Am Legend, which are like supposed to be vampires, and they're just gross. They're like almost zombie-esque. I love the like undead, like just crawled out of the ground vampire. Those are so good. Oof. But you know, it's hard to be seductive when you're ugly. So no, I'm sorry. Oh God. No, don't cancel me. Don't cancel me. It's hard to be seductive when you're a gross undead monster. Okay? No one can be offended by that. Right? Damn it. Whoever wrote Warm Bodies is gonna be bad. Please ignore my squeaky voice. This is like going on to 5 months on testosterone. I'm very squeaky. With our little background on queer coding and queer baiting and fetishization and the inherent queerness of vampirism, now we can talk about Interview with the Vampire. I don't know, just do something there. So generally what I want to argue in this video today is that the book Interview with a Vampire is exclusively queer bait. And then the movie, I think, was intended to be queer bait, but due to Tom Cruise's immaculate performance, it just became gay cinema. It's part of gay history now. Just like the absolute 90s camp that he brings to the screen. He carries that film on his shoulders. If he played it as straight as Brad Pitt, that film would have been fucking boring. I'm telling you, Brad Pitt is so fucking boring in that film. Kirsten Dunst kills it though. I was like, I believe that she's like a woman in a tiny child's body. This is really creepy. I wish desperately that this book was about Claudia. She was by far the most interesting character. And like, I would have absolutely adored a book that was about like being trapped in a child's body. Not only being trapped in a child's body, but being sexualized by the men that created you. That is fucking scary. That would have been like a really interesting, like, feminist novel. I've seen people call Anne Rice a feminist, and after reading this book, I'm like, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, what? This woman writes like a man. Sorry, I'll get into that later. Sorry. So let me give you some examples from the book that, you know, that I can use to argue my point that this is just straight queer bait. All right, you ready? I'm going to read this quote. I'm going to read it just for you. "Now listen to me, Louis," he said. And he lay down beside me, now on the steps. His movements so graceful and so personal that at once it made me think of a lover. I recoiled. But he put his right arm around me and pulled me closer to his chest. I remember the movement of his lips raised the hair all over my body, sent a shock of sensation through my body that was not unlike the pleasure of passion. Like, damn. Okay, just fuck already. Shit. Now just imagine like an entire book written like that. The sexual tension, absolutely palpable, between Louis and every single man he meets. Just every single one. And he never kisses anyone. Never does the sex. Doesn't even hug anybody. Maybe Claudia, I don't know. I mean, unless they're touching him on, you know, like he didn't, it's not a consensual hug, whatever. My point is that this entire book is a tease. I mean, it just does that constantly without any like release, with other like nothing. It just does that all the time. And like, it's not even just with Louis and Lestat. Like, Lestat is a very sexy character. He's very sensual. He's very much like, I'm beautiful, my gorgeous blonde hair. And like, every time Louis describes Lestat, it's like, oh, the iridescent orb of his eyes and his beautiful mess of hair. Like, always, he's like pining after him. And yet he's always like, oh no, not like that. No homo though. That's this entire book, is no homo. I swear to God. The thing with Lestat is that like their relationship never really goes anywhere because Louis is always saying how much he hates him. Which, by the way, love and hate are not like opposites in the way we think. Love and hate are the same side, or different sides of the same coin. Apathy is the opposite. So love and hate have the same sort of like passion in you and just sort of builds this like emotional tension. So like that's why people hate fuck, okay? Like that's a thing. I'm just saying. But it's really important to like show that Louis has an attraction to Lestat, because without that, Lestat would not have any power over Louis, and there wouldn't be this sort of like back and forth of manipulation, this like abusive behavior that we see in Lestat. And it is abusive behavior. It's this very obvious like cycle of abuse that, I mean, it's kind of wild. Like, it's very realistic. It makes me want. I'm a little bit concerned for Anne Rice. I'm a little concerned. Because we see him do things like he's very, very kind and sweet and gentle, and then he like immediately like rage and anger, yelling, screaming. He especially did that with his dad in the book. That you don't meet his dad in the movie, but like I think that's an interesting way that like Lestat is humanized, is that he's like taking care of his blind and sick father and like can't kill him himself, and he's like, Louis, you have to kill him because I can't do it. He's a bitch. But we see this like cycle of abuse with all the other characters. Like, you know, he at first is very doting, and especially to Claudia. He's like, oh, I'm your dad. I'm going to spoil you. I'm going to teach you how to be a vampire. But then he uses his knowledge as a bargaining chip. And he's like, I am more powerful than you. I am above you because I know more than you, but I will not tell you. And that, of course, like for a really long time is the reason that Louis and Claudia feel like they can't leave, because they feel like he really does have information and that they could be in danger without him. And he's like lording that over them. And that sort of brings me to like the fetishizing, is that's what Anne Rice is doing in this relationship, is that Lestat is cruel and abusive, and essentially anytime that Louis like meets another woman, he's sort of like, especially with Babette. Okay, so in the book there's Babette and her sisters and her family, and Lestat wants to kill their only brother, who is like in charge of their estate, and if he dies, like they essentially like they'll be outcast by society if she takes over like the plantation, because she's a woman and like she's not supposed to be in power over this like household. And so Louis is very concerned for this family, even though he doesn't like know them at all. So he's like pining after Babette for a really long time, and he keeps like visiting her in the night, but nothing actually comes out of that. Like he never bites her, he never like tries to have a relationship with her, but there's sort of this tension there where he's like holding on to this humanity, or he's holding on to, the metaphor I see here is that like with Lestat is this sort of deviancy, this deviant sexuality, this sort of temptation that he falls into. And with Babette, he's trying to like reclaim his goodness. He's always fighting with this idea of good and evil, and with the Satan with God and Satan. And he's like, he's totally convinced that he is evil because he's become a vampire. And so he's trying to like reclaim his humanity through these human women. And he's not able to do that. And then he sort of gets stuck with Claudia, who is both a woman, which represents his like what is supposed to be normal sexuality, but she's also a child, and she's like forced into vampirism. So it's again like she is being forced into this deviancy that he now has to struggle with. So the entire novel is his like moral dilemma, which gets really boring after a while. He's super whiny, which is one thing the movie got right, is at the very end when Lestat is like, oh, he's whining again. I've had to listen to this for a century, and I'm like, you're damn right, Lestat. This man's annoying as fuck. Okay, cool. I got some of that out. Got some of my rage out. So with that in mind, let's talk about Armand. So Armand is in charge of the theater of vampires. Or he sort of vaguely is like, if there was a leader, I'd be him. Which is just, Armand, what? He's sort of like, I'm like, you know, I'm the person they look up to, but like I'm not in control of them. So I was like, okay, like you could have just said that, I guess, but whatever. So now we have Armand, and there's a line. Let me find it. I'll never find it. I should have went through this and highlighted things I wanted to say, but no, I will never. Okay, I'm gonna read another dramatic quote to you. I hope you're ready for some dramatic reading. I could see the mortal boy again, as if he were not asleep on the bed, but kneeling at Armand's side, with his arms around Armand's neck. It was an icon for me of love. The love I felt. Not physical love. No homo. I don't speak of that at all. Though Armand was beautiful and simple, and no intimacy with him would ever have been repellent. For vampires, physical love culminates and is satisfied in one thing, the kill. I speak of another kind of love, which drew me to him completely as a teacher, which Lestat had never been. Knowledge would never be withheld by Armand. I knew it. This is super important, okay? This is already breaking the cycle of abuse. So we can see with Armand's character that he's really fascinated with Louis. He's like, oh, you are like, you represent the time. And I can like live in this time through you. And Louis is like, what? I'm at odds with everything. And he's like, exactly. I just need a wig and I'd be Armand. So it immediately becomes like actually like a good relationship. Like they can get something out of being with each other. Like they both want something from each other. Like Louis wants knowledge and Armand wants to feel, or he wants to live vicariously through Louis. And so it's, it's a balanced relationship. It's something that like actually makes a relationship work. Even when they like get together, they're together. They like hang out. It's really, okay, hang on, back up. In the book, Armand and Louis like spend years together. They travel the whole world until like finally Louis is convinced to go back to New Orleans to like basically face his past, to face Lestat and be like, I'm stronger than you now. I've overcome the suffering you've enforced upon me. But in the movie, he's like, fuck you. You killed Claudia and I'm better than you. Which like, okay, yes, like Louis in the book and in the movie has this like very like I'm better than you attitude. It's super weird. He's like, yeah, Armand is super simple, real dumb guy. He's 400 years old, man. He's not stupid. And then he thinks he's like super, like he thinks that Lestat is super like stuck in his human problems and that he's like has a moral like or philosophical like high over Lestat. It's super weird. Louis is such an annoying character. But my point is that in the book, they actually spend many years together and they learn from each other and they generally like become better people. But then like the relationship just like dwindles and like goes away. Like it's, I don't know. It's just because Louis is such an annoying character. He like just doesn't see the good in anything. He's completely like just a pessimist about everything. And even though he's been alive for like 200 years by the end of the novel, and he's just like, no, everything sucks. But I don't have the courage to kill myself. It's just because it just comes full circle. Like beginning of the book, he's like, I don't have the courage to kill myself. And then he becomes a vampire. And then at the end, he's like, I don't have the courage to kill myself because I'm fucking bored with life and I suck. My point is about this relationship is that even though he found a better relationship, a healthier relationship with another man, and it was still being queer baited like hell. Like, I mean, there were so many times in the movie, it was like, just no kiss, just kiss. They were like this close to each other. Yes. But even though he finds that relationship, he just abandons it. Like, he's having this conversation at the end of the book with Armand, and he's like, doesn't realize that Armand is basically asking him if it's okay if he just goes and dies. And then it does. And Lestat's like, or sorry. And then Louis like, oh, that's what was happening. Bruh, how are you gonna call everyone else stupid? That was a rant, I'm sorry. But the point is that there's no happy ending for Louis in any of his relationships at all. Like every single like unhealthy thing that he was just, everything he did was unhealthy, and he didn't learn from his mistakes. He didn't become a better person. And like, how, that's not a good queer story. Like, period. Not a good queer story. So I know I just went through this whole thing where I was like, Armand is a better person. He is, but there is an important scene where Louis feels like he has lost the last bit of his humanity. And that's when he changes Madeline into a vampire. Because he never wanted to, like, transform anyone. He wanted to die and be the end of it. Like, no more making people for me. Which, also a very important note, is that is when he, like, basically accepts his, like, feminine, his ability to, like, create a new life. So that means he has completely crossed over into that, like, I cannot remember. Deviancy. Thank you. So that's when he has, like, completely relinquished his humanity and he's just, like, gone over to this sexual deviancy. He is now a queer. Very important. But what we find out later is that Armand was using his, like, magical vampire powers to convince Louis to do that. So Louis may not have done it if not for Armand. And this is super duper important because that is, like, pushing his boundaries. That is not consent. That is, like, essentially a metaphor for sexual assault, which brings us back to, like, the fetish. This is literally just putting this man into unhealthy queer relationships and, like, showing that, like, they cannot be a good thing and that they will only destroy the good things in his life, like his relationship with Claudia, which was also just really gross. Like, how are you going to be, all right, tangent time. How are you going to be so obsessed with, like, your moral evils and, like, being a vampire, and this whole thing is you, like, trying to come to grips with your morality and your beliefs, but you never once question that you have a super weird relationship with this girl? Like, I know by the end of the book she was, like, 60 or whatever, but, like, she still is in the body of a 5-year-old. This also shows the sort of, like, assumed predatory nature of gay men, is that they will, like, be creepy towards young women, which is super gross. Thank you, Anne Rice. I love that for us. But let me just read you a little quote. Let me read you a little something that really did not sit well with me. When they change Claudia, she is 5 years old, okay? 5 years old. So this is Claudia speaking. "Where is Mama?" asked the child softly. She had a voice equal to her physical beauty, clear like a little silver bell. It was sensual. She was sensual. Her eyes were woman's eyes. I could see it already. No. Incorrect. No. She's 5. She's 5. And even when she's, like, a woman, it's still weird to, like, look at her and be like, that's sexy. No. You can think that her brain is sexy. You can think she's a pretty cool lady. Do not look at her and sexualize her. And this happens throughout the entire book. It's like, she meaning Anne Rice, is always talking about her little waist or her breast. It's always describing her breast. And it makes me so uncomfortable. Like, she's still in a 5-year-old's body. Stop. Please. And that's, like, not the only instance of Anne Rice being weird about women. And I don't know if she's, like, intentionally writing women in this way because she's writing from a male perspective, or if, like, she was trying to write, like, the men of her time. But she was always, like, anytime she described a woman, it was like, oh, they had long, beautiful hair and big tits. Always. None of the women have any personality except for maybe Claudia, but that's because she's, like, I mean, she's part of the whole story. How could you write an entire story without any characterization? Of course you can. I don't even know why I question that. But I guess what I'm saying, like, Claudia, who is a very complex and interesting character, like, it would be hard to not give her character, you know, like, no development. It would be difficult. But my point is that there's all of these things that say that queerness is bad. All the relationships are bad. There's manipulation and abuse. There's predatory behavior. There's this sort of, like, pining for like heteronormativity in a way where he's always like, he wants that, but, like, can't have it. So it's like he, like, doesn't want to be queer, which is, like, yes, I get that. I get that that's, like, that has definitely been a thing where someone is like, I'm gay and I'm uncomfortable with that. Okay, that's fine. I can understand, like, writing that narrative, but not from a straight woman who's, like, obviously, like, getting her rocks off to these gay men. It's weird. It's uncomfortable. Okay, well, I'm gonna end this section here, and I'm gonna go on to Okay, now that I've sort of broke down the things in the book that really bothered me or that I thought was very queerbaity, and also like leaning into that sort of fetish and sort of creating negative stereotypes of queer men, let's talk about what I liked about the movie. And also let's do some compare and contrast. Why not? So some of the things I really enjoyed about the movie are a lot of the imagery, especially in the beginning when Lestat comes to Louis, and you know, the first time they meet, Louis is drunk and he's got himself a lady of the night. And so there's immediately this parallel of like sexual pleasure. Lestat kills the lady, the nice lady who was just doing her job, and also the guy that was like trying to steal his money, which that was a lot happened in that like 5-second interval. It was a bit much. So Lestat kills those two, and then he grabs Louis and he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna nom right on your neck, bro." And they fly up into the air, which doesn't happen in the book. I don't think Lestat has really any powers in the book. I think it's mostly just Armand, which I think is an interesting change they decided to make. And I think why they did it is to make him more seductive, more tempting. Is like, oh, he's powerful. Like, imagine if I had that power. So I think it's a good choice. And it made it more fun. It made it more campy. You know, they flew up above this boat and he's like, "You still want to die?" And then he's like, just drops him to the ocean. So I think, and it also like, it sort of has this parallel of like, you know, you've seen those cartoons where like you're so in love, you have the hard eyes and you're like floating towards like the woman you love or like a pie or something. That's sort of what that feels like. It's like we're like flying into the air with so much passion, and there's already this parallel of like, you know, there was about to be this sexual encounter with the woman of the night. I don't want to say whore, she's a nice lady. So it is immediately sexual. And then the next time they meet, Louis is in bed, like he is in his jammies, and he's like being very pathetically sick, which is just very funny to me. And Lestat like seduces him out of bed, and just like the look of longing in Louis's eyes in that scene, he's just like so enraptured, like it's like wonder in his eyes. I love Brad Pitt was kind of boring, but like his ability to like look like he is absolutely in love, astounding, unparalleled, truly uncanny. Love it, beautiful. And then that there's this continued metaphor of arousal when it comes to the sucking of the blood. Especially like every time that Lestat is like killing a woman, they're always like super into it. They're like getting off on it, and until they realize like they're dying or they are already dead. Side note, most, if not all of those women are people of color. I'm not sure what to say about that. It feels uncomfy because there's no one in the main cast who is a person of color. It's only the whores and the slaves and like the probably indentured servants. Feels pretty icky, but I'm a white person. I'm a mayonnaise jar with a little spice, maybe an aioli. So I'm not sure if I have much of ground to speak on here. So I'll let that, you know what? I'm going to find someone who is a person of color who has talked about that, and I'll get back to you. But all I'm saying is that like the act of drinking blood is obviously very sexual, and there's always like arousal or intimacy associated with the sucking of the blood. So we know that when Lestat is killing Louis, giving him life, it is inherently sexual. It is inherently queer. And that is like, that is clear. That is plain as day. That is not hidden. There's no like underlying metaphor. Like that is obvious. You might as well be like, they gay, they fucking, you know? So that's something I really enjoy about the film, is that even though there is never like an on-screen kiss and there's no like explicit sex between same-sex partners, it is like very clear what the metaphor is that this is gay. And also like Tom Cruise just brings so much camp to this film. Like he has so much energy. I love that he like jumps around. He's always very like, his clothes are always so pristine. He's always got the frills. I mean, he's very much like well kept, which is, you know, the same thing in the book, which again is sort of a very like a queer stereotype of gay men, is like they're very like infatuated with the way they look, the way they dress. But I think because this story takes place in 1791 into like the 1800s, and generally like high society, it was important to look good. So I mean, I think that just like matches with the time, but also like it is a gay stereotype that people have used in the past. So something I also really enjoyed about the writing and the film is that there's always this connection of vampires with God. And in the film, Lestat says, "God kills indiscriminately, so shall we. which, you know, there wasn't much room for philosophy in the film, and they go into more depth in it with it in the book. There's actually this really great quote that was close to the end. All right, this is one of my favorite quotes from the book, which really like illustrates this conversation about good and evil and God and Satan. So, I allowed myself to forget how totally I had fallen in love with Lestat's iridescent eyes, that I'd sold my soul for a many-colored, luminescent thing, thinking that a highly reflective surface conveyed the power to walk on water. What would Christ need have done to make me follow him like Matthew or Peter? Dress well to begin with, and have a luxurious head of pampered yellow hair. This man literally just said Lestat is God. Lestat is just God. Damn, that's gay. But I love this like ongoing metaphor of like comparing their power to a sort of omniscient being, or their understanding of what an omniscient being would be, and that they have control over human life, and that like that power sort of makes them evil, because they have, you know, if you have the power to take human life and you actively do it, okay, I guess that makes you evil. I'm just saying it probably does. But I do like those moments of like philosophical questions of like, what is good and evil, and are they inherently good or evil just because of what they are, and can they overcome that? Like that's, you know, that's a really interesting conversation, and they really gloss over it in the film. They have like a couple little like parts with Armand where they kind of like, there are direct quotes from the book in the movie, but like they're sort of out of context. One of my biggest complaints with the film is that there are scenes that are done really, really well. The scenes that I especially really love are the ones where Claudia realizes what is happening to her and that she will never grow up, and she throws this huge tantrum. That was the best scene in the film. I mean, like, the film isn't good, but I love it. But that scene actually genuinely very good. The other scene is when Lestat is like torturing one of these ladies in the hotel room, and he's like, "Oh, you're dead. Look, you're in a coffin. You must be dead." And like, that scene is so good. But now we get to Claudia, who at first Lestat is like, "Oh, I have a gift for you." And it's because Louis had like was trying to eat Claudia. And he's like, "Oh, look, I brought her. Look, I'm going to turn her into a vampire." And of course, like, that was a manipulative tactic to get Louis to stay with him, because now he's like, "I have to watch over this vampire child. Like, you have just created the greatest of sins, and I have to make sure everything's okay. I have to stay with you." And the great thing with Claudia that they do in the movie is this like parallel of behavior. And so when Lestat's like, "Oh, I have a present for you," and then later on Claudia says the same thing. She's like, "Oh, I have a gift for you," to Lestat to try to like make up, and she feeds him, you know, the dead boys in an attempt to kill him. So we see this like parallel of abusive behaviors that are being like passed on to Claudia. And I think that's really fascinating, especially if we're working with this queer metaphor of like, okay, if two terrible gay men had a child, they would just like destroy this child morally. Which is what Anne Rice is saying, which is the film is saying, basically, is that they would just create a deviant child. I mean, okay, outside of that metaphor, it's really interesting because it's like this seemingly like innocent young girl is like truly a mastermind of evil, which is great. Again, it does like feed into that idea of like two gay men can't be good parents, essentially, which is yucky. Another thing with the film is like this really great use of fire imagery that like keeps popping up every time they're sort of trying to escape something. So Louis burns down the plantation because the slaves found out that they were vampires and they had to get out of there, and basically, I mean, kind of needed to fake their deaths. That's not really mentioned, but it's kind of implied. And then later on, when they're in the house in the city and Lestat comes back from the dead, because he's already undead. He's super not dead, undead. They burn the house down again. Later, finally, there's like his final act of retribution, he burns down the theater. So there's this like continuous metaphor of like destruction through fire in order to like escape the past, or like try to cleanse himself of this evil that he like doesn't want to be a part of anymore. Great use of imagery. Love that for you. A big difference that I really want to talk about is Louis' self-control. So in the film, you know, we have moments of like seeing him run away from Claudia when he was like, I don't want to kill her. What have I done? And then also when he goes to the Theater of Vampires and there's the boy that they essentially use as like a feeder. They all like feed off of him. In the book, in both of those instances, he was not able to stop himself. He had to be like physically separated from those people in order to like not kill them, because every time he like gave in to his impulse, he was not able to control himself. And in the film, both times it was like, oh, he was interrupted by Lestat and then he ran away, or he took one little like bite of the boy. So, and I think the reason they did that Anne Rice did that in the book is sort of to show his like inability to control his tendencies, or he's falling into his temptation. And then I think maybe like in the movie they're like, we don't have time for this. We gotta go. We have so much stuff to put in this 1.5 hour long movie. Which, why did they make it so short? There was like so much information they had to put in that movie. Whatever. I'm so glad it's a TV show, because there's a lot that happened, and like they were very faithful in the movie adaptation, but they like left out a lot of really important information. One thing that I'm glad they did in the movie is when Armand says that Claudia is his lover, he like denies that, because in the book there was like in the same sentence he'd be like, this is my lover, my daughter, and it's just it's really gross. Like, I just really hate the relationship in the book. So like I'm glad they did that in the movie, because it was weird. Why did I write so many notes about these metaphors? Like, it's really not all that important. The only thing I really want to say is in the movie, they made Armand, like, really boring. He's, like, they have this quote in the movie where he's like, we must be powerful, beautiful, and without regret. Okay. Yes, his whole thing was, like, not regretting your actions, because, like, you can't, like, you just have to do them to survive. So you either, like, survive or you die. And I think, like, that was an interesting, like, argument for vampirism and, like, the life they have to lead. But in the movie, they, like, really, really simplified him and made him kind of just annoying. He's just, like, the sexy other guy. But like the book, they both come full circle by the end. So in the beginning of the story, Louis was basically feeding on animals, trying to stay alive. He was eating a lot of rats, super nasty. And then by the end, we see Lestat like stuck in the old home that had been burned down with like all of the like rat carcasses around. And that scene is really interesting because it's not really mentioned in the movie, but it is in the book that like a lot of vampires would just kill themselves or die because they like can't adapt to the time. So in that scene, we see Lestat like freaking out because of the helicopter, and so we see that sort of like oncoming, like, oh, he's not going to survive because he's like can't cope with this newfangled technology, because he's an old man now. He's a fucking boomer. No, he's too old to be a boomer, but like he's a boomer. So we see that happening and we're like, oh shit, he's not gonna make it, even though he like overcame death 20,000 times in the most ridiculous ways. Again, just fucking absurd. I love it. So we have that and we're kind of like, oh shit, he's not gonna make it. But then one thing I really appreciate about the movie is that, so in the book, by the end, the interviewer is like, I gotta go find Lestat, and he just like drives off and that's the end. But then in the movie, they're like, oh no, bitch, we're gonna give you a little more. He gets in his car and Lestat's just in his car. And attacks him, and like the sound design in that scene is just incredible. Like there's that really great like action music when they're like fighting, and like the car almost crashes, and then it sort of like quiets down and becomes that sort of harpsichord little like, it's a little like teasy kind of, I don't know, it's really fun. And he's like, I can't believe you're listening to this guy whining, shut the fuck up. And then he like comes back circle and he's like, I'll give you the choice I never had, and laughs. And I'm just like, I love this fucking idiot man. So generally, watching the film, it's so much fun. It's so much camp. I mean, Tom Cruise is totally like going above and beyond. And like that's generally what a lot of queer cinema is, and is just being like really out of the box. Just being, I mean, I think of Rocky Horror Picture Show and how like it was just ridiculous. But you're having so much fun, and you're like just celebrating your queerness in this film about queerness. And like that's sort of what it feels like watching Lestat just being ridiculous, dancing with a corpse, like his boisterous laughter and like the obvious sexual tension towards the characters, like especially with Armand and Louis, when like their faces are literally this close and you're like, you could just kiss. And they're always like complimenting each other, saying they're so beautiful. And like the one time when Armand is like brushes his hand on Louis' face, and then he goes, it's so fucking dramatic. I'm like, you are in love, stop. And I think it was intended to be queerbaity, but because it's so over the top and ridiculous, and like there's so much tension, even if they don't kiss, even there's no on-screen like intimacy, it's still just, it is a queer film. I mean, it has to be. Maybe it doesn't like disrupt the heteronormative like straight lens as much as it should, but I think like definitely like it's a national treasure. I love watching that film. I laugh every time. I have such a good time watching that movie. The one thing that is disappointing is that we always get, every time Lestat sucks the blood of a woman, we always get like a very intimate view. It's like, oh, the camera gets all up in their boobs, and it's like we watch them dying, or we watch them like making out and being like, oh my god, what's that? And then the one time that he kills the guy who is absolutely queer-coded because he's called like a fop or whatever, it's not on screen. Instead, we're watching like Louis kill the poodles, but it's still there, you know. We still know that was an intimate sexual moment between them. We don't see it, but we know. That's my general consensus about like the book versus the movie and how I feel about the way it was done. And when I'm going to do a part 2 to this video talking about the show, and I'm going to talk more about like the things, how Anne Rice wrote the book versus how it could have been done. But now to finish off the video, I kind of want to talk about the history of what was happening around that time and why I think what she wrote was so problematic. So end this recording here. So let's talk about what was happening when Interview with the Vampire was published and you know, when it was being written. So the book was published in 1976. So let's talk about what was happening in the 60s and 70s. First of all, Stonewall happened in 1969. If you don't know what Stonewall is, it's an essential part of queer history. I really recommend looking it up. I don't want to get too much into it now, but essentially it was the culmination of decades of police raids on queer clubs and them enforcing the 3-article law, which meant that if you were assigned male at birth, you have to be wearing at least 3 pieces of male clothing, and vice versa. If you were assigned female at birth, you had to be wearing 3 pieces of female clothing, and they could put you in jail for this. And generally, I don't think they kept people in jail. It was more of like they assaulted you and then let you go, and you couldn't do anything because they were the police. So this was happening from the 40s to the 60s. Several raids on clubs, people were hurt, people were killed. It was an extremely violent time. And so it all culminated at Stonewall, where the riots began. So that was 69. So we already know this was generally a very dangerous time to be queer. The book takes place in Louisiana and New Orleans. Now, Louisiana, as you probably know, is the Deep South. Sodomy laws began the late 1800s to the early 1900s, and started to be federally repealed in the 60s, but weren't completely repealed until 2003. Meaning that sodomy laws are still on the books in Louisiana. And if for some reason they decided to reverse that ruling, they would go back into effect in Louisiana today. If that's what the federal government decided to do, the Supreme Court. Same thing with, if you know the Supreme Court ruling of Obergefell, I can't speak words. I don't know what words are. Of Obergefell versus Hodges, which was in 2015. That was the Supreme Court ruling that made gay marriage federally recognized. Same thing in Louisiana is that, you know, there wasn't gay marriage until 2015. I'm not entirely sure if that one is still on the books. So if Obergefell was repealed, it could potentially still be illegal in Louisiana, but I'm not sure. The point is that it was dangerous to be queer from like the early 1900s until like the early 2000s, and probably still now. Even though it's like legally they can't do anything, it's still in the Deep South. Additionally, if you don't know what the gay and trans panic defense is, let me give you a little breakdown. The gay and trans panic defense is legal in court. If you kill someone who is trans or gay, you can argue that you panicked when you found out, and that's why you killed them. And that is a legal argument that you can make. Now, I don't know. I assume you still get, you probably still get manslaughter, but the point is that your sentence is not going to be as bad because you can use that defense in the court. And that's still legal in Louisiana today. So all this to say is that if someone who is truly queer writing a queer narrative in the early 70s in Louisiana, they probably either weren't able to publish at all, or were ridiculed or attacked, or it was dangerous to write a genuinely queer narrative in Louisiana in the 70s, or just generally in America. And so the fact that Anne Rice can write this very queer-baity, queer-coded, like just queer enough to not make her straight audience uncomfortable, and she can benefit from this story, is really gross. Like, that's super not cool. And especially when we're speaking about same-sex abuse. So I recently read Carmen Maria Machado's memoir, In the Dream House, which is about same-sex abuse. And I was reading a lot of her interviews and how she was like terrified to write this book because she didn't want it to fall into those stereotypes, which is what I talked about earlier with like the fetishizing, like the masculine female who is abusive towards like the more effeminate female, like this sort of assumed gender binary, even in a same-sex relationship. Like, she wanted to be really careful about that because she was writing a true story of what happened to her, but at the same time, like, wanted it to be authentic and honest and represent mental health in a way that wasn't just like, she was crazy. It was like, she needed help. I tried to help her, and I felt stuck in this relationship because I wanted to help her. And like, that is a genuine fear for anyone in an abusive relationship, not just queer relationships. I mean, this is how abuse happens in any relationship. And so for Anne Rice to write about this like extremely toxic, abusive, manipulative, queer relationship in a way that is like so stereotyped and fetishized and creepy and uncomfortable and dishonest is really harmful to the queer community, because this is like the narrative that a lot of straight folks get, is the ones written by straight folks. So they're not looking at like the genuine narratives of queer folks. They're looking at the ones that make them comfortable. And because I was trying to argue with myself, I was trying to be like, okay, well, it was the 70s. Like, I mean, she didn't know better. Or like, I don't know, a lot of people like wrote stuff like this in the 70s. And yeah, that's true. But at the same time, we got narratives like The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin in 1969, which, by the way, go read it. It's an incredible story. And it challenges gender in a way that like no one was really willing to do. So it's about this planet of people who don't have genitalia until they're, I don't remember the word for it, but essentially when they're like ready to make babies, then the partners will like, their bodies will take on the genitalia of what their bodies need to do. So one of them will take on, like, one of them will have a womb and one of them will have like seminal fluid, and they create the baby. But there's not like, I mean, it could be different every time. Like, that's not their, just because one time they had the womb doesn't mean the next time they'll have the womb. So they have no set gender. And it's a really fascinating story, and especially like because the narrator is a cis het man from Earth and trying to understand this. So like that, and it's a really great story. It's really well written. Same thing with Rocky Horror Picture Show. It came out in 1975, and that was like an explicitly queer narrative. I mean, there was a gay sex scene, and there was like lots of like, you know, there was like queer women, there was queer men, there was Frankenfurter. So there was like bisexuality, there was cross-dressing, and so Frankenfurter, that's like a confusing thing with like transness, is that he was a transvestite, which I guess at the time I think was more like a man dressed as a woman and not necessarily transgender in the way we understand today. But anyway, the point is there was like explicit queerness, and it was silly, it was goofy, it was campy, it was fun, and now it's a cult classic. Like, people love that movie, even though it like is a queer narrative, and probably because Frankenfurter is kind of like the bad guy, and it was like a little queer codey thing. But anyway, it's a queer narrative. The same thing with The Birdcage in 1996. So, and that's like, the movie came out in 94. So like, these are films that came out around the same time as that film. There was To Wong Foo. Okay, the whole title is To Wong Foo. Thank you for To Wong Foo. Thanks for everything, Julie Newmar. I don't know why that's the whole title, but it's a great film. It came out in 95. So there's like there's a history of queer film that's coming out at the same time as Interview with the Vampire, where they actually have good queer narratives. So like, there's no excuse for us to like be putting out content that's harmful to the queer community in the 70s and the 90s. There's no excuse. So, in conclusion, while I recognize that the film has its problems, and it wasn't really meant for the queer community. It was definitely meant for like the male gaze. It was meant for like straight heteronormative comfort. I understand that, but at the same time, I think that it's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy watching it, and I can see it and read it as a queer narrative, even if I don't like feel reflected in it. I still think it's a great film. The book, however, is just too problematic, and I can't tell whether or not Anne Rice is trying to write from a problematic narrative standpoint, or if she's problematic. I mean, I can't really like separate her from the character, and in order to do that, I would probably have to like read more of her stuff, and I really don't want to because it was super boring. Like, I just did not enjoy reading that novel. It reminded me a lot of Frankenstein, and that it was very like romantic in the language. Like, there was very lots of flowery language. It like went on and on for like long periods of time describing things, which at first is kind of neat because it's like, oh, I have my vampire eyes and I can see everything now. Everything's beautiful. And I was like, okay, cool. That's pretty nice. After a while, it gets exhausting, and I was really tired of reading it. I really had to push myself to read this. So I don't want to read more of her stuff. And also, like, I know that she's been a problematic person in the past. I know her big thing was like sending lawyers after fanfic writers because she didn't want anyone like recreating her stuff, which is really insane, an insane thing to do. And she also would like attack reviewers on like Amazon, and if anyone like didn't like her work, and she would be like really offended by it, which is really weird. So I know that like she's been problematic in the past. She's defended like Paula Deen when there are all those like accusations of racism. I don't want to say accusations because they were like true. So when she came out as racist, anyway. So I definitely think that there's like elements of like her being too comfortable with slavery that made me uncomfortable too. And I want to talk more about that in the next episode, because in the show, Louis is a black man, and that's such a great like reclamation of the original narrative, is that like not only is this show like explicitly queer, but we're also like, we're not doing that slavery thing. We ain't doing that shit. We're gonna have a powerful black man on screen. And I'm like, fuck yeah, you do that shit. That's good shit. So anyway, I'll talk more about like some of the icky, not okay, yucky, nasty like treatment of POC in the book in the next episode. And I'll probably talk more about like her female characters and how they're garbage. I have many thoughts, and I simply cannot saying them. Cannot stop saying them. So thank you for listening. I don't know where to put this, but I just want to be like, I just look with your vampire eyes. My brand. I love this stupid fucking movie. Yeah, put that in there somewhere. I don't know. I don't really think I need to say how we can do that better, because this was, so late, so long ago, and we're already doing much better. And I mean, they're doing it right now with the new show. So I don't feel like I need to do that. But I do kind of want to talk about like the like moving forward with vampire stories and how they've become very fascinating to me, and how much I love them. Actually, I'm not gonna do that. I know how to end a video, I swear. All right. Well, that was most of my thoughts. I still have many other thoughts about the imagery and metaphors and all the weird shit that happens in this book, but I'm gonna shut up now because they're not relevant to the underlying queer narrative, and they will not help this video be better or more cohesive. So I will stop talking. I'm done now. I'm done. Have a nice day. Did I even introduce myself? Hey everybody, I'm Oz. This is Lamp. I know you're probably like, wasn't it about geckos before? Not anymore. Now it's about moths. Please enjoy my video about vampires.